Get out of my house." Daniel's voice was ice. He grabbed Emily's wrist and twisted hard, shoving her backward into the doorframe while Olivia watched from the hallway, silent, smiling. He laughed, not embarrassed, not guilty, contemptuous. "After everything I gave you?" He reached into his jacket, pulled out a document and threw it at her feet. Divorce papers. Already signed, already dated, he had prepared them months ago. "You were never part of this life, Emily. You were the placeholder." Then he turned his back on her and closed the door. If you believe every marriage deserves the truth, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Emily Carter had spent 11 years being the kind of wife other women admired from a distance and secretly pitied up close. She was organized, she was loyal, she was steady in the way that people only become after they have quietly absorbed years of small disappointments, without ever making a scene. She kept the house running, managed the finances Daniel allowed her to see, remembered the names of his colleagues' spouses, and packed his suitcase every October with the same careful attention she gave to everything in their life together. She folded his shirts the way he liked them. She tucked a handwritten note into the front pocket of his carry-on. Not because the gesture was reciprocated, not because he had ever once looked for it, but because Emily Carter was the kind of woman who still believed that love was demonstrated through consistency, and she had made consistency her religion. Daniel Carter was a project manager for a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in Columbus, Ohio. He was tall, clean-cut, and spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. He could hold a dinner party spellbound with stories about contract negotiations in cities he had visited. He remembered punchlines. He laughed at the right moments. He was, by every external measurement available to their social circle, a good husband, and every October, without exception, he packed that same dark navy suitcase and drove to the airport for his annual corporate leadership retreat in Chicago. 7 years, 7 trips, 7 weeks of identical excuses filtered through the same apologetic voice. "You know how it is, Em, the conference runs long. Then the dinners, and by the time I get back to the room, it's past midnight. I'll call when I can," and she believed him, not because she was foolish. Emily had graduated near the top of her class at Ohio State. She had worked 5 years in hospital administration before choosing to step back and support Daniel's career when his consulting work began requiring more of his time and attention. She was sharp, organized, and deeply intuitive in ways she had learned to suppress because Daniel had a particular way of looking at her when she expressed doubt about anything, a slow exhale through the nose paired with the mildest possible smile, the kind of expression that said, "Here we go again." She had learned to silence the voice inside her that noticed things. The way he triple-checked his phone before setting it face down on the kitchen counter when they ate dinner together. The way his stories from the Chicago trips were always vivid and detailed about the conference rooms and the steakhouses, but strangely vague about the people, the colleagues he claimed to be building relationships with. She had met none of them. In 7 years, not one of Daniel's so-called Chicago colleagues had attended their home, called the house, or appeared in a single photograph he brought back. She noticed. She said nothing. She folded his shirts and tucked the note into his pocket and drove herself home from the airport and waited. The first real crack appeared in August, 3 years into the trips. She had been going through old email accounts, looking for a recipe she had forwarded herself years ago, and she found a receipt confirmation, a hotel booking in Chicago. Standard corporate rate, confirmation number and room number and check-in date all matching the trip perfectly. She had felt relief, not suspicion. "See, Emily, you were being paranoid. Everything checks out." But then she looked at the room number, room 114, and she remembered, without trying to remember, that Daniel had mentioned his room the previous year. He had said it with unnecessary specificity, the way people sometimes did when they were rehearsing a detail rather than recalling one. "They stuck me in room 114 again, same as always, right by the ice machine. Never fails." She had laughed because she was supposed to laugh. 2 different years, the same room number, the same hotel, the same rate. She told herself it was a coincidence. Hotels had loyal guests. Companies booked consistent rooms for consistent travelers. It meant nothing. But the voice inside her, the one she had spent years learning to quiet, had heard the coincidence and decided to stay awake a little longer. By the following year, she had started paying closer attention. Not in the way of a suspicious wife rifling through her husband's belongings. She was too proud and too composed for that, and somewhere beneath the pride was a terror she couldn't name yet. The terror of discovering she was right, so instead she watched. She listened. She catalogued the small inconsistencies the way a careful person catalogues evidence they aren't ready to act on. The year Daniel came home from Chicago with a sunburn. She asked him about it casually over dinner. "L'Conference days," she said. "I didn't know they scheduled outdoor sessions." Daniel looked up from his plate. The pause lasted exactly 1.5 seconds too long. They moved one of the afternoon breakout sessions to a rooftop venue. New place they're trying out. He took a drink of water. "Brutal sun, I should have worn sunscreen. It was a perfect answer. Smooth, reasonable, specific. The kind of answer a man gives when he is prepared for the question." She smiled. She said nothing. She cleared the dishes and stood at the kitchen sink and quietly memorized the way his voice had shifted register by half a note when he delivered that particular sentence. The following spring, she ran into Patricia Malone at the grocery store. Patricia's husband, Greg, worked at the same firm as Daniel. They had attended 2 company picnics together, exchanged pleasantries at the Christmas party, the usual choreography of spousal acquaintance. Patricia had hugged her and asked about Daniel, and Emily had mentioned the upcoming Chicago trip. Patricia had looked at her with an expression that Emily would spend 6 months trying to decode. It wasn't pity. It wasn't discomfort. It was something more careful than either. The look of a woman making a split-second decision about how much to say. "Oh, right," Patricia said, the retreat. She had smiled and moved on, and the conversation shifted to children and property taxes and the new bakery opening on Elmwood Avenue. But Emily had seen the look. She had stored it in the same careful drawer where she kept the hotel room number and the half-note voice shift and the sunburn explanation. By September of that year, the drawer was getting crowded. She had started quietly and without telling anyone, reviewing their joint financial accounts with more attention than she previously had. She was the one who managed the household budget. Daniel handled his business accounts separately, which she had always accepted as practical, a clean division between personal and professional finances. But she began cross-checking what she could access against what she knew about their actual expenses. The numbers were not adding up. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have alarmed a casual observer. But Emily had a meticulous mind, and meticulous minds notice small gaps before they become large ones. There were expenses she couldn't trace. Small withdrawals, transaction descriptions that were generic in a way that felt deliberate. Amounts that moved from their joint account into Daniel's business account under the label of reimbursable travel costs, but in quantities that exceeded what any sane company would classify as standard. She sat at the kitchen table one evening with a notepad and a calculator while Daniel watched television in the next room, and she added up 18 months of ambiguous transactions. The total was not small. She pressed her fingertip against the final number on the notepad and felt the drawer inside her finally lock shut. She needed to know, not because she wanted to destroy her marriage. She did not want that. She had spent 11 years building something with this man, and she was not yet ready to believe it was built on nothing. But she needed to know what was real and what wasn't. She needed to stop carrying this silent weight of things she noticed but couldn't name. She did not tell Daniel what she was thinking. She did not tell her sister or her closest friend, a woman named Cora who would have immediately demanded action and advice that Emily wasn't ready for. She thought about calling a therapist. She called her brother instead. Michael Carter was 44 years old, 3 years younger than Emily, and had spent 12 years working as a private investigator before leaving the field for a quieter life managing his own small security consulting business. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed exits before he noticed entrances, who had seen enough of human nature to be difficult to surprise. Emily called him on a Tuesday evening when Daniel was out at what he described as a work dinner. She told him everything, not with tears or dramatics, just the way she would have delivered a case summary to a hospital administrator. Chronologically, factually, with the appropriate pauses between significant details. When she finished, Michael was quiet for 4 seconds. "How many years?" he said. 7 trips, 7 Octobers, and you never followed up on the financials before now." I trusted him, she said it simply. Michael was quiet again. He said, "I'm going to ask you one question and I need you to answer it honestly." "Okay, what do you actually think is happening?" She pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table and made herself say what the drawer had been holding for years. "I think he has another life somewhere. I think the trips are real, but the reason is a lie. I think there's a person involved, and I think there's money involved, and I think he has been making choices, deliberate choices for a very long time." Michael exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said, "don't touch the financial records." Don't alert him. Don't change your behavior by a single degree. What are you going to do? I'm going to help you find out exactly what's happening, he said. But I need you to do something first. What? I need you to decide right now whether you want to know the truth. Because once you have it, you can't unknow it. Emily looked at the notepad on the kitchen table, at the number at the bottom, at 7 years of October suitcases and folded shirts and handwritten notes tucked into front pockets. I need to know, she said. Then we start now. Over the following 3 weeks, Michael began assembling information with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made a career of uncovering what people worked hard to conceal. He did not involve anyone else. He did not explain his methods to Emily in detail because he knew that details this stage would send her emotions into awes before the facts were complete. He told her only what she needed to know to prepare for what came next. He told her the hotel booking is real, but it is not a corporate account. It is a personal reservation made annually under Daniel's own name. The conference does not exist in any professional registry associated with Daniel's firm or industry, and the address associated with one of the financial transactions Emily had flagged traced to a residential properties in a suburb north of Chicago. Emily sat with that information for 3 days. She did not sleep well. She went through the routine of her days with the surface calm of a woman who had practiced calm as a survival strategy for over a decade, and she thought and she planned and she made her decision. The morning of October 8th, Daniel packed his Navy suitcase with the same efficiency he always used. He moved through the house with the comfortable ease of a man who had performed this ritual so many times that he no longer noticed the performance of it. He accepted the coffee Emily made and drank half of it, standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling his phone with his thumb. Flights at noon, he said. Not looking up, I know, Emily said. I set the reminder. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at her then, a long, ordinary look, the kind that had stopped meaning anything specific years ago and had become instead a daily habit of mutual acknowledgement. I'll text you when I land, he said. I know you will, she said. He kissed her on the cheek. He picked up his suitcase. He walked out the door. Emily stood at the kitchen window and watched his car back out of our driveway and disappear down the street. She stood there for a full minute after the car was gone, her hand around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth of the ceramic against her palm. Then she set the cup in the sink, turned around, and walked to the bedroom where her own bag was already packed. She had booked her flight 6 days earlier, under her maiden name, Emily Walsh, a different airline, a departure time 1 hour after Daniel's, arriving at O'Hare 40 minutes before him due to a layover he didn't have. She had arranged for Michael to meet her at the airport. He would be her eyes and her backup and her witness, because Emily Carter, who had spent 11 years trusting a man who had spent 7 of those years building a second life, was not going to do this alone, but she was absolutely going to do this. She checked her bag. She checked her phone. She looked at the handwritten note she had prepared for Daniel's suitcase pocket and had, this year, not packed. She put it in the kitchen drawer instead. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the door. At the airport, Emily moved through security with her heart beating a controlled percussion that she willed herself to treat as manageable information rather than an emergency signal. She found Michael at their agreed meeting point near the coffee kiosk at gate C14, and he handed her a coffee without asking if she wanted one. He land yet, she said. 42 minutes out, Michael said. His flight was delayed slightly. We'll have positioning before he clears baggage. She nodded. You look like you haven't slept, he said. I've slept fine. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been lied to by better liars than his sister and chose not to press the point. They reviewed what Michael had confirmed in the final days before the trip. The property north of the city, in a neighborhood called Glenwood Park, was registered to a company called Terrapath Holdings LLC. The company had been incorporated 6 years ago. The registered agent was a law firm, which was standard practice for concealing beneficial ownership, but Michael had traced the utility accounts, the maintenance contracts, and 3 years of property tax correspondence, all of which led back to a single name: Daniel Robert Carter. The same Daniel Robert Carter who was currently touching down at O'Hare International Airport, presumably believing that his wife was at home in Columbus, trusting him. Emily sat in the gate chair and processed this information again. Not for the first time. She had processed it many times over the preceding days. But there was a difference between knowing something and sitting at the airport where you were about to see it, confirmed with your own eyes, and the difference lived somewhere in the chest, in the region where she had once kept all of the hope that this was going to turn out to be nothing. That region was very quiet now. I need to ask you something, she said to Michael. ask when we see him when he comes through the arrivals exit. What if I freeze? Michael looked at her directly. You won't, you don't know that. I know you, he said. You've been carrying this for 3 years. You are not going to freeze. You are going to stand there and watch what there is to watch, and you are going to let your eyes do what your instincts have been trying to tell you to do for longer than you realize. She looked down at her hands, at the rings on her left hand, at the plain gold band and the small diamond that Daniel had proposed with in a restaurant in Cincinnati on a cold February night, years and years ago, when she had believed completely that this was the beginning of the life she was supposed to have. Okay, she said. Okay, Michael said. They waited. Daniel came through the arrivals exit at 2:47 in the afternoon. He walked the way he always walked, with his navy suitcase rolling behind him and his jacket folded over one arm and his phone already in his hand. He had the look of a man who was entirely comfortable with where he was. Not tired, not searching, purposeful in the way of someone arriving at a destination they are looking forward to, not a business obligation they are tolerating. Emily saw him from 30 yards away, partially obscured behind a pillar near the rental car kiosk. She pressed her back against the pillar and watched. A white luxury SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the arrivals curb, the kind of vehicle that spoke of deliberate expense. It stopped precisely where Daniel was walking, which meant Daniel had known exactly where it would be. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was younger than Emily by perhaps a decade, polished in the way that required consistent effort and a significant budget. Dark hair cut close around her face, she moved with an ease that said she had done this many times and found it entirely comfortable. She and Daniel looked at each other across the roof of the car. He smiled. Emily had not seen that smile in years. She recognized it because it had once been directed at her, a long time ago, before she became the person Daniel came home to, rather than the person he was going toward. It was the smile of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, the smile that she had assumed had simply left him as they grew older and more routine. It hadn't left him. It had just moved. The woman walked around the front of the car, and Daniel closed the distance between them in 3 strides, and they embraced the way people embrace who have been missing each other, not performing an arrival but completing one, and then he kissed her. Emily watched this from behind the pillar, with her hand pressed flat against the concrete surface, and felt something shift in her chest that she would later describe to Michael as a door closing. Not slamming, not breaking off its hinges with the force of anger or grief. Simply closing, with the quiet and irrevocable certainty of something that has been opened for the last time. Michael's hand came to her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She kept her eyes on Daniel as he picked up his suitcase, put it in the back of the SUV, and got into the passenger seat beside a woman whose name, at that moment, Emily did not yet know. She would know it before the day was over. You okay? Michael said. Emily peeled her back from the pillar and turned to face her brother. Her face was composed, her hands were steady. She felt the full weight of what she had just seen settle into her bones, and she stood under the weight of it and did not bend. Follow them, she said. They took Michael's rental car. He drove. Emily sat in the passenger seat and did not cry and did not speak for the first several minutes. And Michael gave her the silence she needed without performing concern or filling space with reassurance she hadn't asked for. They followed the white SUV north through the city and then out of it, into a quieter stretch of residential streets, where the houses grew larger and further from one another, and the lawns were deep with the last of October's green before the cold took it. The SUV turned into a neighborhood Emily didn't know. Past a stone sign that said Glenwood Park, down a curving street lined with mature trees, it stopped in front of a townhouse, 3 stories. Cream brick, a porch with a wooden swing, window boxes with autumn flowers, the kind of home that looked lived in and cared for and deliberate. Daniel got out of the car. He carried his own suitcase up the front steps. He did not wait for the woman to unlock the door for him. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his own key. Emily watched from the parked car down the street and felt the last available chamber of doubt go quiet. That's his house, she said. Yes, Michael said. He has a house. He has had it for at least 6 years, as far as I've been able to confirm. 6 years, 6 out of 11 years of marriage. She had been married to Daniel for 11 years, and for more than half of that time he had owned a house in a suburb of Chicago where he came every October to live with another woman using a key that had always been his. She thought about the handwritten notes, the ones she had tucked into his front pocket every year. Whether he had read them, whether he had discarded them before he got into her car, whether she had been packing affection and hope into a suitcase that was never traveling in the direction she believed. She thought about this very carefully, and then she took out her phone and called Michael's contact, the forensic accountant he had referred her to 3 days ago, and she left a voicemail confirming their appointment for later that week. She was not going to let grief make her imprecise. She needed information. She needed documentation. She needed to understand the full architecture of what Daniel had built behind her back before she did a single thing that could alert him or limit her options. She looked at the townhouse, at the window where a light had come on in a room on the second floor. "What's her name?" Emily said. Michael hesitated 1 second. "Olivia Bennett. She's a marketing director. She works for a company called Summit Brand Solutions. She and Daniel have been," he paused, "she and Daniel have known each other for at least 7 years. 7 years. The entire duration of the October trips." Emily absorbed this. "So she wasn't something that happened to the marriage," Emily said. "No, she was happening while the marriage was something he maintained separately." Michael didn't answer. The answer was in the silence. Emily looked at the townhouse one more time. At the warm light in the second-floor window. At the autumn flowers in the window boxes. At the front door behind which her husband was, at this very moment, putting down his suitcase in a life she had never been invited to see. "Take me back to the hotel," she said. Michael started the car. "I need 3 days," Emily said. "I need to see everything there is to see. Every financial record, every piece of property documentation, every connection between him and that company and that house and whatever else he's built out here." "I'll have it ready," Michael said. And Michael, "Yeah, don't let me do anything before it's complete. Don't let me go knock on that door because I want to. Don't let me call him. Don't let me send a message I won't. I spent 11 years reacting to things Daniel created," she said. "I'm not going to let the next thing I do be something he can use against me." Michael drove. Emily sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and the full, terrible clarity of what she now knew pressing down on her like weight she had been carrying for years without realizing it had a shape. Outside, the trees of Glenwood Park moved in the autumn wind. In the townhouse on the curving street, a second light came on. Emily watched the road in front of her and let the weight settle and did not look back. Emily did not sleep that night. She lay on the hotel bed in her clothes, staring at the ceiling with the kind of stillness that isn't peace, but its opposite, the stillness of a mind working at full capacity with nowhere to put the output. The room was quiet. The city outside made its distant sounds. And somewhere north of where she was lying, in a cream brick townhouse on a curving street in Glenwood Park, her husband was sleeping in a bed that belonged to a life he had built while she was folding his shirts. She had known on some level for years. She understood that now. The drawer she had been filling with noticed things and unexplained moments and half-note voice shifts had not been paranoia. It had been intelligence she hadn't been ready to act on. And now that she had acted, now that she had stood in an airport and watched Daniel smile at another woman with the smile Emily had believed was simply gone from him, the intelligence had a name and an address and a face. What she hadn't anticipated was the specific quality of the pain. She had expected rage. She had expected the kind of grief that made a person cry until their body gave out. She had expected to feel broken in the way she had always feared being broken, the way she had spent 11 years unconsciously organizing her life to avoid. Instead, she felt something closer to precision, like a lens coming into focus after years of blur. She sat up at 4 a.m. and opened the notepad on her phone and began writing down every financial discrepancy she could recall from the past 3 years of account reviews. Not because she hadn't already done this, she had done it multiple times. But her mind needed somewhere to put its energy, and the most useful place she could direct it was toward the evidence, toward the concrete and documentable truth of what Daniel had done, because that was the terrain where she had power, and she intended to understand it completely before she did anything else. Michael knocked on her door at 7. She opened it before he finished knocking. He looked at her face and did not comment on the fact that she had clearly not slept. He came in and set 2 coffees on the small table by the window and sat down and opened his laptop. "I got into the property records last night," he said. "Deep dive, tell me." Terrapath Holdings LLC was in 6 years and 2 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm called Brandeis & Cole. They handle shell company administration for about 40 other LLCs registered in the same quarter, so that part isn't unusual. What is unusual is the funding trail. Emily wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. How was it funded? Initial property purchase was $412,000. The down payment, $84,000, came from a business account registered to a company called Carter Meridian Solutions. Emily's hands tightened around the cup. "I've never heard of Carter Meridian Solutions. You wouldn't have." It was incorporated 8 years ago, a year before TerraPath. It's registered in Delaware, which is standard for liability shielding, but the contact information traces back to a mailbox service in downtown Columbus. Their city, the city where Emily and Daniel had built their life together. He set this up from home, she said. He set this up while living with you. Yes, she set the coffee down. She pressed her fingers against the table surface and breathed through the specific ugliness of that detail. Not from a different city, not after they had separated, not during some defined period of crisis in the marriage. From inside the house they shared. From the desks in the study where she had occasionally brought him tea on late work nights, assuming he was managing client accounts. What else is Carter Meridian Solutions connected to, she said. Michael turned the laptop toward her. This is where it gets significant. She looked at the screen. At a web of connected accounts and business entities that Michael had mapped over the past 72 hours. She was not a forensic accountant, but she was a former hospital administrator with 11 years of budget management experience, and she could read a financial diagram, and what she was reading made the precision in her chest sharpen further. Carter Meridian Solutions had received deposits from Daniel's primary consulting firm, labeled as contractor payments for services rendered. Standard looking on the surface, the kind of entry that would pass a cursory review. But the services invoiced strategic communication consulting, executive briefing documentation, market analysis reports were generic descriptions that corresponded to no deliverable any client of Daniel's firm had ever actually requested. He had been billing phantom services to real clients and routing the money through a company that existed on paper in his name. How much total, Emily said. Michael hesitated. Michael, how much? Over 6 years, the confirmed amount flowing through Carter Meridian and into TerraPath Holdings for the property and its maintenance is approximately $160,000. But that's the confirmed trail. The actual number may be higher. We'd need a forensic accountant with subpoena access to verify the full picture. $160,000. Emily had managed their household on a careful budget for years. She had tracked grocery costs and utility bills and argued with herself over whether to repaint the kitchen because the expense felt unnecessary. She had trusted Daniel's explanation that business cash flow required conservative personal spending until the firm's growth stabilized. $160,000. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Michael for a moment. Emily, Michael said quietly. I'm fine. She turned around. Her face was controlled and her voice was level, and her eyes were doing something that Michael recognized from the worst moments of their shared childhood, a quality of focus that their mother had always called frightening in a complimentary sense. Who else knew? Michael closed the laptop halfway. That's the part I wanted to discuss with you this morning. Robert Hayes, she said. Michael looked at her. How did you? Because Robert handles Daniel's business accounts. He has for 4 years. Daniel trusted him with everything administrative. There is no version of this financial structure that Robert didn't know about. She sat back down. Did you find a connection? Robert Hayes is listed as a secondary authorized contact on the Carter Meridian Solutions account. Not as a registered officer, just authorized contact for correspondence purposes, which is the kind of arrangement you create when you want someone to have access without having their name prominently attached. Emily felt something cold move through her. Robert Hayes had sat at her dinner table. He had attended their 4th of July party 3 years running. His wife, Diane, had hugged Emily at the company Christmas event last December and said, "You are such a wonderful support to Daniel. He talks about how much he appreciates you," and Emily had smiled and thanked her and meant it when she said she was glad Daniel had good people around him. Diane Hayes had either not known what her husband was part of, or she had. Emily was not ready to open that particular door yet. What about Olivia Bennett? She said. Michael reached into the folder he had brought with him. He produced 3 printed pages and slid them across the table. Marketing director at Summit Brand Solutions. She's been with the company 9 years. She and Daniel met at a conference, a real conference, ironically 7 years ago, based on email records that became accessible through a business account she used for some correspondence with Carter Meridian. Emily looked up sharply. She was corresponding with Carter Meridian? She requested a formal contractor engagement through Carter Meridian 18 months ago. Listed services rendered as brand consulting and strategic communications support. Michael paused. It appears to have been structured so that she could justify time and travel expenditures to her own employer without raising questions. Emily that sentence twice. Olivia Bennett had not simply been the other woman. She had been incorporated into the financial architecture. She had a business relationship on paper with the shell company Daniel had built. She had used it to fund her own freedom to be with him without her employer monitoring the expense reports. This was not an affair built on passion and poor judgment. This was a collaboration. She knew about the money, Emily said. She knew enough to participate in the structure, yes. She helped him hide it. That's the reasonable interpretation of the documentation. Yes. Emily stood up again. She couldn't sit still with this information. She moved to the other side of the small room and back again, not pacing in agitation but thinking on her feet, the way she had always done when a problem her require move through it physically. I need to see the property, she said. Michael looked up. Emily, not to confront him, not today. I need to see it from the outside, in daylight, and I need to understand what I'm actually looking at. I need to see it with my own eyes and my own mind without it being dark and without me being in the car processing the shock of what I'd just watched at the airport. Michael considered this for 3 seconds. We go in my car, we don't stop, we drive past once and you look and we keep moving, that's all I need. They drove to Glenwood Park at 9:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet, with the particular quiet of a weekday morning in an upper-middle-class suburb, a few dog walkers, a delivery truck, the ambient sound of lives being lived without urgency. Michael drove at the speed of someone who belonged there, which was the correct speed. They turned onto the curving street. Emily saw the townhouse from 200 yards away. In the daylight, it looked different from the night before. More real somehow. More permanent. The cream brick caught the morning light, and the window boxes were precisely the kind of detail that required ongoing care and attention. Someone had planted those flowers and tended them and replaced them seasonally. And Emily thought about the fact that in their Columbus house, the window box above the kitchen sink had been empty for 3 years because she kept meaning to plant something, and there was never quite the time. Daniel had found the time here. As they drew level with the house, Emily saw the front porch clearly, the wooden swing, a small table with 2 chairs, a doormat with a pattern she couldn't read at this speed. And in the window of the front room on the ground floor, she saw Olivia Bennett standing with a coffee cup in both hands, looking out at the street. They were past the house in 4 seconds. Emily faced forward and did not turn her head. She was in the window, Emily said. I saw her. She looks comfortable. Michael said nothing. She looks like a woman in her own home, Emily said. She looks like someone who has never once considered the possibility that any of this would be taken from her. She said it without hatred, with something more precise and more dangerous than hatred, with the specific observation of a person who is building a complete picture and wants to see every detail clearly. They drove back to the hotel. Michael had arranged to call with Paul Nguyen, the forensic accountant he had referred Emily to earlier in the week. Paul joined them by video at 10:15, a composed man in his mid-50s with an accountant's manner and an investigator's eyes, who listened to Michael's summary of the financial documentation and asked 4 questions with the efficiencies of someone who had seen this architecture before. The shell company structure is clean but not sophisticated, Paul said, which actually makes it easier to trace, not harder. Sophisticated structures use multiple jurisdictions and nominee directors. This is a domestic LLC with a thin contractor paper trail. I can work with this. What do you need from us? Emily asked. Everything Michael has compiled, plus whatever you can legally access from the joint account statements, transfer records, anything in your name. If you have access to any business documentation Daniel kept at home, copies of anything that would be useful, but don't remove originals. Don't touch anything original. I understand, and Mrs. Carter, Emily, I want to be clear about something before we go further. Paul looked directly at her through the screen. Based on what Michael has described, there may be exposure here that goes beyond civil divorce proceedings. The structure of the invoicing and the client billing warrants a look at whether there's been any fraudulent misrepresentation to the firm or to clients. That's a different category of legal issue than financial fraud against a spouse. Emily absorbed this. You're saying Daniel may have committed fraud against his own company. I'm saying the documentation suggests the possibility needs to be examined by someone with the appropriate legal credentials. I would strongly recommend you speak with a family law attorney this week, someone experienced in high-asset divorce with financial misconduct, and discuss with them whether bringing in additional legal resources makes sense. Do you have a recommendation? I'll send you 2 names this afternoon, Paul said. Both are based in Ohio. Both have experience with exactly this kind of situation. The call ended at 10:55. Emily sat with Michael in the quiet of the hotel room and let the morning's accumulation of information settle into the structure she was building. "He's going to know something is different when I go home," she said. "What do you mean? I mean, Daniel is not a stupid man. He is a careful, deliberate man who has maintained an elaborate deception for 7 years without significant error. When I go home and I am not the same Emily who packed his suitcase and tucked a note in his pocket, he is going to notice." Michael nodded slowly. "You think he can read you. I think he's been reading me for 11 years and adjusting his behavior accordingly. That's how this worked. He knew what I would question and what I wouldn't. He knew how much to give me and how much to withhold. He is very good at calibrating." She paused, "Which means I need to be better. How long do you think you can maintain it?" "Long enough," she said. "Paul needs 2 weeks minimum to build the financial documentation into something actionable. I can give him 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks you go home and act like everything is normal." "I go home and act like everything is exactly what Daniel expects it to be." She looked at her brother, "Which is the thing he underestimated about me. He thought I would never look. He thought I was the kind of woman who accepted the life she was given because she didn't believe she deserved to demand the truth." She stood up. He was wrong about that. Michael looked at his sister for a long moment. Then he closed his laptop and stood up too. "When do you want to fly home?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I want one more day here first." She spent that afternoon alone, which she had asked Michael for directly and which he had respected without argument. She walked for 2 hours through the city, not toward Glenwood Park, not toward the airport or the hotel or any place with a specific purpose. She walked because she needed to be in motion, and because she needed the city's indifference, the way a large city simply continued around a person regardless of what they were carrying, and because she needed to do something with her body while her mind worked through everything she was not yet ready to feel. She thought about the 11 years, not as a catalog of betrayals, though she could have built one. She thought about them as a record of choices she had made in good faith with the information available to her. She had chosen to trust Daniel. She had chosen to believe the stories. She had chosen each October to pack the suitcase and tuck the note and stand at the kitchen window and watch him go. Those had been her choices, made from love and from a belief that marriage was built on faith. She did not regret the faith. She regretted that it had been placed in someone who was carefully managing her perception of him rather than giving her something real to believe in. She stopped at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue and sat at a table by the window and called her sister for the first time since arriving in Chicago. Her sister's name was Carol, and Carol was the warmer and louder of the two of them, the one who called twice a week and always had an opinion and sometimes had the right one. Carol said when she picked up,
"How's Columbus?"
"I tried you Tuesday, I know." Emily paused. "I'm actually in Chicago." A beat of silence. "What are you doing in Chicago?" "I needed to see something for myself." "What does that mean?" Emily looked out the window at the street. "It means I needed to know the truth about something, and the only way to know it was to come here." Carol's voice changed register. "Emily, what's happening?" It was not a question. It was the voice of a woman who knew her sister, who had always known her sister, who had spent 47 years watching Emily hold things quietly until she couldn't anymore. "Daniel has been lying to me," Emily said, "for a long time, about a lot of things. I know the truth now. I'm still processing what I'm going to do with it." Carol was quiet for 5 seconds. This from a woman who was almost never quiet for 5 consecutive seconds. "Are you safe?" Carol said. "Yes." "Is Michael with you?" "Yes." "Okay." Another pause. "What do you need from me right now?" Emily felt something loosen slightly in her chest at the question. Not Carol demanding details, not Carol spiraling into panic or anger on her behalf. Just, "What do you need?" "I need you to not call Daniel," Emily said. "I need you to not say anything to anyone, especially Diane Hayes. I need you to let me handle this the way I'm handling it." "Done," Carol said immediately. "All of it done, and I need you to be available. When I'm ready to talk through everything. I'm not ready yet." "I'll be here," Carol said. "Take the time you need." "But Emino, you are not alone in this." Emily pressed her free hand against her sternum for a moment. "I know," she said again, and meant it differently this time. She flew home to Columbus the next morning. Daniel picked her up from the airport. This had not been planned. She had intended to take a rideshare, but Daniel had texted when her flight landed he was back from Chicago, had arrived home the previous evening, and had seen her car still in the garage, which meant she had taken a cab to the airport originally, and he was offering to come get her. To say no would have been unusual. To say yes meant sitting in the car with him for 40 minutes. She said yes. He pulled up to arrivals at 11:20, and she put her bag in the back and got in the passenger seat, and he leaned over and kissed her cheek exactly the way he always did and said, "How was the trip?" "You didn't tell me you were going somewhere. Last minute," she said. "Carol needed some company. She's been having a hard few weeks." Daniel nodded sympathetically. He navigated out of the airport with one hand on the wheel, the same easy competence he brought to everything, and asked about Carol and her husband, and whether the situation was anything serious, and Emily answered each question with the accuracy of someone who had prepared her cover story carefully, and the calm of who had spent 11 years learning to keep her voice level when her interior life was something else entirely. She sat in the passenger seat of her husband's car and watched the highway unspool ahead of them and felt the particular, unbearable intimacy of being physically close to someone who had become a stranger. Not a new stranger, but the specific kind of stranger who had been standing right next to you for years while you believed you knew them. "How was Chicago?" she said, when the silence had lasted the natural length that precluded suspicion. "Exhausting," Daniel said. "The sessions ran long 2 days in a row. I got back last night and slept 10 hours. That sounds like what you needed." "Yeah." He glanced at her briefly. "Sorry I didn't call as much this week. It's fine," she said. "I know how it is." He looked at the road. She looked at the road. 40 minutes. She counted the exits. When they pulled into their driveway and Daniel took her bag out of the back and carried it to the front door, Emily stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at the house she had lived in for 8 years. The house she had chosen with Daniel. The house she had maintained and cared for and believed was the container of her real life. She looked at the empty window box above the kitchen window. She made a decision, quietly and completely, standing in the driveway while Daniel unlocked the front door. She was going to plant something in that window box before this was over. Not for Daniel, not for the marriage, for herself. Because she had been meaning to for 3 years, and she kept finding reasons to wait, and she was done waiting for her own life to become the priority. She walked inside. Over the following 2 weeks, Emily Carter became the most disciplined version of herself she had ever been required to be. She was present at dinner every evening. She asked Daniel about his day, and listened to his answers and responded appropriately, and did not once look at him in a way that revealed what she was thinking. She managed the household with her usual precision. She texted her sister brief updates with no details and kept every conversation with Michael to brief phone calls she took from her car in the driveway, ostensibly on brief errands. Paul Nguyen worked through the financial documentation with the speed of someone being paid for urgency. He sent Emily encrypted updates every 3 days. Each update added another layer to the picture. The confirmed amount redirected through Carter Meridian Solutions to TerraPath Holdings and associated expenses was revised upward from Michael's initial estimate. The full trail following all connected accounts Paul could access or trace through legitimately available records suggested a figure closer to $220,000 over the full 6-year period. Some of it had gone directly into the townhouse purchase and maintenance. A meaningful portion appeared to have funded Olivia Bennett's lifestyle directly travel, gifts, and at least 2 significant cash transfers made from a Carter Meridian account to a personal account registered in Olivia's name. Daniel had not merely built a secret life. He had funded it with money he had been siphoning from the financial infrastructure of the life he shared with Emily. Paul's second significant finding concerned the client billing structure at Daniel's firm. 2 clients had apparently been invoiced for services that included Carter Meridian as a contracted vendor, which meant the deception extended beyond Emily. It extended to Daniel's professional obligations. To clients who were in good faith for work that was being partially diverted through a company to funnel Unsi into the secret life. Paul sent Emily the name of a second attorney to consult alongside the family law specialist. This one handled professional misconduct cases. Emily sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Daniel was at the office and read the full summary Paul had assembled. She read it twice slowly, with the same attention she had once given to hospital compliance reports, making sure she understood every implication before she responded to any of it. Then she called the family law attorney whose name Paul had recommended. Her name was Sandra Okafor. She was 52 years old, had been practicing family law for 24 years, and had a voice that conveyed both precision and a complete absence of sentimentality, which was exactly the combination Emily needed. Emily gave Sandra the full summary in one organized, uninterrupted account. Sandra asked 7 questions. Emily answered all 7 with documentation references. Sandra was quiet for 4 seconds. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "you have prepared this extraordinarily well. I had good help. Your brother's background is evident. A pause. I want to schedule an in-person meeting for next week. Before that meeting, I want you to do 3 things. Go ahead. First, make no financial moves, no transfers, no withdrawals beyond normal household expenses, nothing that could be characterized as asset concealment on your part. A pause. Second, make copies of everything you have and store them somewhere Daniel cannot access. A cloud account in your name only or a physical location outside the house. Done, Emily said. And third, Sandra's voice was level and direct and entirely without drama. Third, Sandra said, decide what outcome you want. Because with the documentation you have described, you have significant options. I want to walk into our meeting next week knowing which direction you want to move in. Divorce with full financial recovery, criminal referral, both or something else entirely. Each path has different timelines and different implications for you personally. Emily looked at the kitchen table, at the space where the folder would eventually sit, the folder she was building, the folder that contained 7 years of a secret life her husband had maintained while she folded his shirts and tucked notes into his pocket. I know what I want, Emily said. Tell me. I want everything he hid from me to be visible, she said. I want the full truth on the table. I want every hidden dollar accounted for. And I want to walk away from this marriage with exactly what I am entitled to and not $1 less. Sandra Okafor made a short sound that might, in a different context, have been called satisfaction. Then let's get to work, she said. Emily hung up the phone. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment. From outside came the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, a car on the street, a dog somewhere, the distant percussion of a lawn service 2 houses down. The sounds of a life that looked, from the outside, entirely normal. She stood up. She went to the hall closet and found the small bag of potting soil she had purchased 3 years ago and never opened. She found the trowel. She went to the window box above the kitchen sink, and she spent 20 minutes pressing soil into the box and arranging the small cluster of late-season chrysanthemums she had picked up from the garden center 2 days ago, for no reason she could have named at the time, except that they were there and she wanted them. She stepped back and looked at the window box. It looked exactly the way she had always imagined it would. She turned away from the window and picked up her phone and opened the calendar. There was one more thing she needed to do. She needed to call Daniel and tell him she would like to have dinner together on Friday evening. Just the 2 of them, nothing special, just dinner. He would agree. He always agreed to dinner. He didn't know yet that the dinner she was planning was not the dinner he was expecting. He didn't know yet that the woman sitting across from him would not be the woman he had been managing for 11 years. He had spent 7 years believing he understood Emily Carter completely. He had studied her limits and her tendencies and her capacity for trust and built a life around the confidence that she would never look. She had looked, and what came next was not going to be a conversation he was prepared for. Friday arrived the way significant days always did, wearing the face of an ordinary one. Emily woke at 6, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window with her cup in both hands, looking at the chrysanthemums in the window box she had finally planted. They had opened further overnight, the way flowers did when they found themselves in soil that suited them, and she stood there for a full minute just looking at them before she turned around and began the day. Daniel came downstairs at 7, already dressed for a morning meeting, and poured himself coffee without looking up from his phone. He was in the middle of a text exchange with someone, his thumb moving quickly, and he set his cup down on the counter and picked it up again and moved through the kitchen with the distracted efficiency of a man whose mind was already somewhere else. "You're up early," he said, still looking at the phone. "Couldn't sleep," Emily said. He glanced at her briefly. "You okay?" "Fine," she said. "Just thinking about dinner tonight. I thought I'd make the lamb, the one you used to like." Something in his expression shifted, not suspicion. Not quite, but a small recalibration. The lamb was a significant production. She hadn't made it in 2 years. "Yeah? What's the occasion?" She smiled at him. "No occasion. I just thought it would be nice. Just the 2 of us." It's been a while. He looked at her for 1 second longer than necessary, and in that second, Emily felt the particular awareness of being studied by someone who had spent years reading her behavior for signs of deviation. She held his gaze with the practiced steadiness of a woman who had spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. "Sounds good," he said. He picked up his keys. "I'll be home by 6. I'll have everything ready," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen and exhaled slowly and picked up her phone and sent Michael one text. "Tonight." His reply came in 30 seconds. "I know. Call me after." She put the phone in her pocket and started the day. She didn't cook the lamb. She had never intended to cook the lamb. The lamb was the story she needed Daniel to carry into the evening with him, the details that acts as a suspect through his work days that would make him arrive home at 6 o'clock, expects a quiet dinner with his compliant wife, rather than the conversation that was actually waiting for him. What she prepared instead, at the kitchen table, while the afternoon light moved across the room, was the folder. It had existed in pieces for 2 weeks in encrypted files on her laptop, in the copies Michael had made, in the document Paul Nguyen had assembled, and Sandra Okafor had reviewed and organized into a sequence that told the story of Daniel Roberts' success in a language that required no interpretation. Financial records, property documents, business registration filings, bank transfer histories, email excerpts from the Carter Meridian correspondence files, photographs Michael had taken in Chicago, time-stamped and legally obtained, showing Daniel arriving at the Glenwood Park townhouse on 4 consecutive October mornings. Sandra had reviewed the complete package on Wednesday and told Emily, in her precise and unsentimental way, that it was among the most thoroughly documented cases of financial misconduct and marital deception she had seen in 24 years of practice. Emily had assembled the physical folder with the same attention she gave to everything. Not dramatically, not with the shaking hands of a woman in crisis, but carefully and deliberately the way you organize something you want to last. She set it at Daniel's place at the dinner table. Then she sat down across from it and waited. He came home at 6:12. She heard the garage door, heard his car, heard the door from the garage into the kitchen open, and the familiar sequence of sounds that constituted his arrival, home keys on the hook, jacket over the chair back, the brief tap-tap of his phone on the counter. "Smells good," he called from the kitchen, though nothing was cooking. He walked into the dining room. He stopped. Emily was sitting at the table, both hands folded in front of her, and across from her, at his usual place, was the folder. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. He looked at the folder again. His voice was careful. "What is this?" "Sit down, Daniel." He didn't move for 3 full seconds. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rapid, practiced assessment of a man who had spent years managing situations before they could manage him. He was reading the room, reading her posture, her expression, the specific quality of her stillness, trying to determine how much she knew, and therefore how much of his usual apparatus he needed to deploy. "Sit down," she said again. Not loud, not with heat. Simply again he sat. He did not reach for the folder. He kept his hands on the table and looked at her, with an expression he used in difficult conversations, the one that projected calm competence and faint concern, the expression of a man who was managing you while appearing to simply be present with you. "Whatever this is," he started, "I want you to know that I open it." Emily. He stopped. She watched him decide. Watched the brief war between the instinct to control the narrative and the knowledge that she already knew something, that the folder contained something real, that the usual approach of getting ahead of the information and reshaping it before she could form her own conclusions was not going to work this time, because the information was already organized and sitting directly in front of him. He opened the folder. He looked at the first page, a printout of the Terapath Holdings LLC Incorporation documents, with his name circled in red where Paul Nguyen had identified the beneficial ownership trace. The color in his face changed, not dramatically. Daniel was not a man who made dramatic expressions, but something drained from beneath the surface of his composure, and Emily saw it go, and she sat completely still and let him see. He turned to the second page, bank transfer records, Carter Meridian Solutions, dates, amounts, destination accounts, 6 years of movement organized chronologically. His jaw tightened. Third page, property tax documents for the Glenwood Park address. Fourth page, the photographs, Daniel arriving, Daniel and Olivia at the front door, her hand on his arm, his posture relaxed and proprietary in a way that said home. He closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the table. When he looked up at her, the expression had changed again. The managed calm was still there, but it had been joined by something else, not guilt. Not yet, but the particular alertness of a man who is reassessing his position in real time and has not yet decided what posture to adopt. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," Emily said. Her name is Olivia Bennett," Emily said. "She's a marketing director. You've known her for 7 years, which is the entire duration of the October trips. The house in Glenwood Park has been in your name through Terapath Holdings for 6 years. Carter Meridian Solutions has redirected approximately $220,000 of marital and professional funds over that period. Robert Hayes is an authorized contact on the Carter Meridian account." She paused. "Do you want me to keep going, or do you have something you'd like to say?" Daniel was very still. How did you— He stopped himself. I followed you, Emily said. October 8th, I was at O'Hare when you arrived. I followed you to Glenwood Park. I watched you go inside with your own key. She looked at him steadily. I've spent 2 weeks since then with a forensic accountant and a family law attorney. Everything in that folder has been reviewed and documented by professionals. The stillness in Daniel broke then, but not in the direction she had anticipated. He didn't become defensive immediately. He became very quiet in a different way, not the managed quiet of before, but something rawer. He pressed his hands flat on the table and looked down at them and breathed. Emily, he said, and his voice was different, smaller. I know there's nothing I can say that makes this. Then don't start with that, she said. Don't start with what you can't say. Tell me something true. You owe me at least one true thing. He raised his eyes to hers. And for the first time in perhaps years, Emily saw something in her husband's face that wasn't managed. It was the expression of a man who has been caught so completely that the apparatus of management has temporarily failed him. And what was underneath was not malevolence. It was something more complicated and, in some ways, more difficult to sit across from. He looked genuinely wrecked. How long were you going to keep doing it? She said. He didn't answer immediately. Daniel, how long? I don't know, he said. That's not an answer. I know it isn't. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the folder. I kept thinking there would be a right time to I don't know. To end it. Or to I don't know, Em. I kept thinking I would figure out what I wanted and then make a decision. I was never able to make the decision. So instead you made 1,000 smaller decisions, Emily said. Every false expense report. Every fake invoice. Every October when you packed your suitcase and kissed me goodbye and drove to the airport and got in her car. She paused. Every time I tucked a note in your pocket, he flinched. She had not expected the flinch. She had expected stonewalling, or calculated remorse, or the particular brand of marital gaslighting she had been subjected to in smaller doses over the years, the slow redirect, the gentle reframe, the way he could take her legitimate concern and make her feel, by the end of the conversation, that the concern itself was the problem. She had not expected him to flinch at the mention of the notes. Did you read them? She said. He was quiet. Daniel. The notes I put in your pocket, did you read them? Yes, he said. His voice was rough. I read them. Every year she absorbed this. The specific cruelty of it, not that he had been indifferent to the gesture, which would have been easier, but that he had read the notes and kept going, that he had held in his hand the evidence of her love and faith, and walked through the door of another woman's house with it still in his pocket. What did you do with them? She said. I threw them away, he said, before she could see them. Emily looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had chosen, this man she had organized her life around, this man who had spent 7 years reading her handwritten affections and discarding them before his other life could see. Why, she said. Why did you do all of it, not the affair? I can make sense of the affair in a way I wish I couldn't. But the money, Daniel, the shell company, the fake invoices to clients. Robert, why did it become that? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because I was in too deep too fast, he said finally. I didn't plan it to be. I didn't sit down and design this. It started with one trip, one conference, and Olivia and I, he stopped. Started again, and then it was the next October and I couldn't stop, and the house seemed like a solution because hotel expenses were getting harder to explain, and Carter Meridian was already set up for other purposes, and it seemed like a way to make it work without anything collapsing. Without anything collapsing, Emily repeated, meaning without your marriage ending, without your professional reputation being affected. Without having to actually choose. Yes, so you chose to take the choice away from me instead. He had no answer to that. I could have made a decision, Daniel, she said. If you had come to me 3 years into this marriage and told me the truth, I would have had the chance to make a decision. I would have been devastated. I would have been broken. But I would have had the truth, and I could have decided what to do with my own life. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Instead, you took that from me. For 7 years, you managed my perception of reality so precisely that I spent a decade wondering what was wrong with me. I thought I wasn't interesting enough or engaged enough or present enough. I thought the distance between us was something I had caused. Let me finish. Her voice was even. Controlled. Not cold, but with the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this not to perform it but to ensure they actually say it. I want you to understand what the real damage is. Not the money, not even Olivia. The real damage is that you turned me into someone who didn't trust her own instincts. Every time I noticed something, I talked myself out of it. Because you had been so consistent, so smooth, so good at making me feel like the problem was my perception rather than your behavior. That's not a mistake. That's not a bad decision made in a difficult moment. That's something you maintained deliberately and consistently. For years, Daniel looked at the table, his throat moved. "You're right," he said. The two words landed differently than she expected. She had been prepared for argument. She had been prepared for him to fragment the responsibility, to distribute it across their marital history, to find a way to make her complicit in the outcome. She had not been prepared for him to simply agree. She didn't trust it. "I need to ask you about Robert," she said. He looked up. "What about Robert? He's an authorized contact on Carter Meridian. He's been helping you cover the financial trail. How much does he know?" Daniel's expression shifted. "Robert knows about the company. He helped set it up. He didn't know everything about where the money was going." "That's not an answer, I believe," Emily said. "He knew there was another." Daniel stopped. "He knew I was maintaining a separate situation." "He didn't know the full scope." "Diane," Emily said. "No," Daniel said it with certainty. "Diane doesn't know anything. Emily filed this." She didn't know yet whether she believed it, but she filed it. "What happens now?" Daniel said. His voice had the quality of a man asking a question he doesn't want the answer to. "Now I tell you what I've decided," Emily said. He waited. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. "Sandra Okafor is my attorney. You'll be hearing from her office early next week. The financial documentation has been provided to her in full. She will be pursuing recovery of marital assets that were fraudulently diverted, which amounts to the full value of the Carter Meridian transactions traceable to marital funds." Daniel's face tightened. "Emily, the firm, if this becomes public, that's not my problem," she said. "You made choices. The choices have consequences. I am not going to manage the consequences for you the way I managed everything else. The firm could investigate. If they look at the client billing, then they will look at the client billing," she said. "Daniel, I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not going to protect you from the results of what you did. I spent 11 years being the person in this marriage who absorbed and smoothed and managed. I am done doing that." He stared at her, then he did something that surprised her again. He didn't argue, he didn't threaten. He pressed his hands against his face briefly, both palms over his eyes, and sat there for 3 seconds in a gesture that was more honest than anything he had done in the conversation so far. When he lowered his hands, he looked exhausted in a way that was real. "Is there anything," he said, "anything I could say that would—" "No," Emily said. Not with cruelty, with clarity. "No," she said again. "There's nothing you can say tonight that changes what happens next. But I do want to say one more thing to you, and I need you to hear it. Not as your wife defending herself, but as the woman who knows exactly who you are." He looked at her. "I don't hate you," she said. "I want you to know that because I think you're expecting me to hate you. And I think you might even be counting on it, because rage is manageable and you know how to handle it. This is not rage," she touched the folder briefly. "This is just the truth. What you did was a deliberate, sustained betrayal of someone who loved you and who trusted you completely. And I am not going to minimize it or forgive it quickly or perform generosity I don't feel. But I am also not going to let it become the defining thing in my life. You do not get to be that." Daniel was very still. Emily stood up from the table. She had one more thing to do tonight, and it required her to make a phone call she had been preparing herself for, since she first sat down with Michael in that Chicago hotel room and began to understand the full shape of what her husband had built. She left Daniel sitting at the dining room table with the folder in front of him and walked into the kitchen and picked up her phone. She called Diane Hayes. She had considered this decision for a long time. Sandra had advised caution. Anything that could be construed as communication designed to influence witnesses or complicate the professional misconduct angle needed to be carefully managed. But Sandra had also acknowledged that Emily's relationship with Diane was personal, predating the professional connection, and that a brief, factual conversation was Emily's right as a human being with a relationship to protect on her own terms. Diane answered on the third ring. "Emily," she said, warmly the way she always said it. "Diane," Emily said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before you hear it from somewhere else. Daniel and I are separating. I'm filing for divorce. It will be public information." Very silence. "Oh, Emily," Diane's voice was careful. "I'm so sorry. Are you? What can I do?" "There's something else," Emily said. "My attorney is going to be in contact with the firm regarding some financial matters connected to Daniel's business accounts. Robert may be asked to provide documentation. I wanted you to be aware that this is coming." A longer silence this time. "Robert." Diane's voice had changed. "I'm not going to tell you more than that tonight," Emily said. "But I wanted you to hear from me first, because you hugged me at the Christmas party last year and you told me Daniel appreciated me, And I think you meant it kindly, and I am choosing to believe you didn't know everything. Diane was possessed that Emily checked the call was still connected. I didn't, Diane said finally. Her voice was barely audible. I didn't know Emily. I swear to you, Emily believed her. Not with complete certainty. She had learned something about the limits of complete certainty in the past 3 weeks, but with the intuition of a woman who had learned to trust her own read on people more than she trusted reassurance. Okay, Emily said. Take care of yourself, Diane. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Through the doorway, she could hear Daniel still at the table, the slight sound of movement, the quiet of a man sitting alone with the evidence of his own choices. She picked up her phone and called Michael. He answered immediately. How did it go? He didn't deny any of it, she said. Nothing. He admitted the company, the money. Olivia, Robert's involvement. He tried to frame it as something that evolved rather than something he planned, but he didn't deny the facts. Michael was quiet for a moment. How are you? Emily considered the question honestly. I am, and paused, looking for the right word. Clarified. I feel like someone turned a light on in a room that's been dark for a long time, she said. And the room is not what I thought it was, but at least I can see it. Michael exhaled. What do you need tonight? Nothing, she said. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to wake up tomorrow and call Sandra and begin whatever comes next. She paused. I called Diane. Emily, no. Sandra will understand. It was the right thing to do. She moved to the kitchen window and looked at the chrysanthemums, bright against the dark outside. She didn't know. Yes, Emily said. I think she's about to find out that her husband knew a lot more than she did, and she's going to need someone in her corner. I just wanted her to know someone called her first. When she went back to the dining room, Daniel was still sitting at the table. He hadn't moved the folder. He hadn't gotten up to pour a drink or make a call or do any of the things she might have expected from a man in his position. He was simply sitting there, and when she came into the room, he looked up at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not quite devastation, not quite relief, not quite the beginning of something, just the raw and hollowed look of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, involuntarily put it down. I'm going to bed, Emily said. I'll sleep in the guest room. You should make arrangements for somewhere to stay starting next week. Sandra's letter will arrive Monday or Tuesday, he nodded. She started toward the door. Emily, his voice was low. She stopped. She did not turn around. I'm sorry, he said. I know that doesn't. I know there's no version of that sentence that means what it needs to mean. But I am. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I know you are, she said. I think you are, but Daniel, sorry is what you feel for yourself right now. It's going to take a long time before I can tell the difference between that and being sorry for what you did to me. She walked down the hall and into the guest room and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor and let herself feel, for the first time since Chicago, the full unmanaged weight of all of it. Not in a way she was performing for anyone. Not with the controlled precision she had held herself to for 3 weeks. She sat in the quiet guest room of the house she had shared with her husband for 8 years, and let herself feel what it was to have loved someone truly, and to have discovered that the life you built on that love was constructed on a foundation that had never been what you believed it was. She cried, not for long, but honestly. Then she lay down on top of the covers without undressing, stared at the ceiling, and thought about what came next. There was a great deal to do. Sandra had outlined the process, and it was not going to be fast or simple. The financial recovery alone would require sustained legal engagement. The professional misconduct angle, which Sandra had referred to a colleague at a firm that handled corporate litigation, was its own track with its own timeline. Daniel would need legal representation, and when he got it, the dynamics would shift again. Robert Hayes's role would need to be examined. The firm would need to be notified. There would be depositions and documentation requests and every variety of institutional process that people underwent. The private architecture of a life was exposed to the light of formal inquiry. It was going to be difficult. She was prepared for it to be difficult. What she was not prepared for what arrived at approximately 2 a.m, when the house was fully quiet and she was lying in the guest room, in the particular stillness of someone who has crossed a point of no return, was the call from Cora. Cora was her closest friend, the one she hadn't told. The one she had specifically and deliberately kept outside the information circle for 3 weeks, because Cora was the most emotionally reactive person in Emily's life, and Emily had needed to move through the investigation phase with the coldness of someone who was not yet ready to feel. Cora called at 2 a.m. Emily looked at the screen for 2 rings and answered. Cora, Emily Walsh Carter, Cora said, and her voice was shaking. I have been sitting with something for 3 weeks, and I cannot sit with it anymore. Emily sat up slowly. What are you talking about? She said. I saw them, Cora said. 2 years ago at the airport, Columbus Airport. I was picking up my mother. Early flight, barely awake, and I saw Daniel. She stopped. He was with a woman. They were in the arrivals hall. And they were together. Emily, I knew what I was looking at, and her voice broke. I convinced myself I was wrong. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself if I said something and I was wrong, I would ruin everything. And I have been living with it for 2 years, and tonight I had a dream about it, and I woke up and I can't. Cora, Emily said quietly. Stop. Cora stopped. I know about all of it. A long silence. You know, I know. It's handled, or it's being handled. Emily pressed her hand against her sternum. I know you didn't tell me, and I understand why, and we are going to have a very long conversation about this when I'm ready. But not tonight, Emily. I am so sorry. I know you are. She meant it. Cora, I'm okay. I want you to hear that. I am genuinely okay. She paused. I found the truth myself, and I made the choices that needed to be made. And it's going to be a hard road for a while, but I am okay. She heard Cora crying on the other end of the line. Can I come over tomorrow? Cora said. Yes, Emily said. Bring coffee, the good kind. She hung up and lay back down on the covers. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the room at the end of the hall, Daniel was presumably lying awake in the bed they had shared for 8 years, in the life he had maintained as a container for the one he actually wanted, with the knowledge that the container was gone now, and what remained was the full visible consequence of every choice he's had made. Emily looked at the ceiling. She thought about the chrysanthemums in the window box. She thought about Sandra Okafor's voice, precise and unsentimentally confident. She thought about Paul Nguyen's summary report with the final number at the bottom. She thought about the folder on the dining room table, still open to the photographs, still showing Daniel walking through the Glenwood Park, Castone Key. And she thought about what Sandra had said to her on Wednesday afternoon, at the end of their second meeting, when Emily had asked her a question she hadn't planned to ask but needed to. She had asked, "Does this get better?" Sandra had looked at her across the desk with those precise, unsentimental eyes. "Mrs. Carter," she had said, "in 24 years of practice, I have sat across from a great many women in the position you're in right now. And I will tell you what I tell all of them." She had paused. The ones who do well are not the ones who were the least hurt. They are the ones who decide at some specific point that the hurt does not get to make the choices anymore. She had looked at Emily directly. You have already made that decision. You made it in Chicago when you chose evidence over confrontation. You've been making it every day since. The answer to your question is yes. It gets better. But the getting better is something you are already doing. Emily lay in the guest room of the house she was leaving and held on to that for a while. Then she closed her eyes. Not because she had found peace. Peace was not the right word for what she had found, and she was too honest to call it that. But because she had found something more durable than peace. She had found the solid, unmovable knowledge of what was true, and she had the documentation to prove it, and she had a plan, and she had Michael and Sandra and Paul and Cora and Carol and herself. And herself. After 11 years of organizing her life around Daniel Carter's needs and Daniel Carter's stories and Daniel Carter's carefully managed version of reality, Emily Carter had walked into the truth with her eyes open. What came next was not going to be easy, but it was going to be hers. Sandra Okafor's letter arrived at the house on Monday morning at 10:47 a.m. Emily knew the exact time because she was sitting at the kitchen table with Cora when she heard the mail slots open and close, and she looked at her watch the way a person looks at a clock when they know a specific hour is arriving. Cora stopped talking mid-sentence. They both listened to the sound of the envelope landing on the hallway floor. "That's it?" Cora said. "That's it," Emily said. She got up, walked to the hallway, and picked up the envelope. It was plain and white and had Sandra's firm name in the upper left corner in small, professional type. She carried it back to the kitchens and set it on the table between them without opening it. Because it wasn't hers to open, it was Daniel's. She had already received her copy directly from Sandra on Friday. Daniel had moved to a hotel Saturday morning. He had packed 2 bags with the efficient silence of a man who understood that the time for conversation had passed and that everything remaining between them would happen through attorneys. He had paused at the kitchen doorway on his way out and looked at Emily with an expression she couldn't fully categorize Something that contained remorse and something that contained the beginning of the defensive posture a person adopted when they were preparing to protect themselves legally, the two things existing simultaneously in his face in a way that was honest in its contradiction. "Sandra's letter comes Monday," Emily had said. I know. He had looked at the chrysanthemums in the window box. He hadn't commented on them. He had picked up his bags and left. Now the letter was on the kitchen table and Cora was sitting across from it with her coffee and her particular quality of agitated concern, which she expressed by not expressing it, which for Cora required visible effort. "He's going to fight it," Cora said. "Probably," Emily said. "His attorney will advise him to. They always do at first. And the money? The $220,000, that's what the litigation is for." Emily picked up her own coffee. "Paul has built a documentation trail that Sandra describes as airtight for the civil recovery. The professional misconduct piece is separate and moves on its own timeline, but Sandra's colleague Marcus has already made preliminary contact with the firm." Cora shook her head slowly. "Robert Hayes," she said with a particular disgust. "I always thought there was something slick about that man." "He knew," Emily said. "Not everything, but enough to make choices," and Emily set her cup down. This was the part she had been sitting with all weekend, the piece that didn't fit as cleanly into the structure of righteous clarity she had otherwise managed to maintain. "Diane called me back Sunday morning. She'd been up all night." "What did she say?" "She said she found a file on Robert's computer. After our call Friday night, she went looking." Emily paused. "She found correspondence between Robert and Daniel going back 4 years. Detailed correspondence. Robert wasn't just an authorized contact on Carter Meridian. He was actively helping Daniel route some of the later transfers through a secondary layer that doesn't appear in the primary documentation Paul assembled." Cora stared at her. Which means Paul may have underestimated the total," Emily said. "Which means Marcus's investigation into the professional misconduct piece has a second subject now. Which means Diane Hayes spent Sunday morning sitting in her kitchen, reading 4 years of emails, proving her husband helped her friend's husband steal from his wife and from their clients. She looked at the table. She called me from her car. She was parked in a grocery store lot." "She didn't want Robert to hear her, Emily," Cora said softly. "I know. What did you say to her?" "I gave her Sandra's number and Marcus's name, and I told her she had every right to be furious and every right to protect herself." Emily looked up, and then I asked her if she was safe, physically safe. "With Robert," and she said yes. She said Robert was the kind of man who lied with documents. "Not his hands." Emily paused. "She's filing to her own attorney. She called him Sunday afternoon." The morning moved. Cora stayed until noon, and Emily was glad for it, glad for the company that didn't require performance, for the friend who had spent 2 years carrying a secret that had been slowly poisoning her and who was now channeling her guilt into fierce, practical loyalty, bringing food and coffee and the kind of presence that filled the house without filling it with noise. After Cora left, Emily called Sandra. "The letter was delivered this morning," she said. "I know. We sent it certified as well, so delivery is confirmed." Sandra's voice was brisk in the good way, the way of someone who was already 3 steps ahead. "I've heard from Daniel's attorney. He retained Mark Forsyth. You may know the name." Emily did know the name. Mark Forsyth was a divorce attorney with a significant local reputation for aggressive financial negotiation on behalf of high-asset clients. "He retained Forsyth immediately," Emily said. "He had someone already lined up. It appears so." "Yes." Sandra paused 1 beat, which tells us something. "It tells us he was more prepared for this than he appeared Friday night," Emily said. "It tells us the Friday night conversation, whatever it contained, did not prevent him from making a rapid strategic decision over the weekend." Sandra's voice was level. "This is not unusual. Men in Daniel's position often present a genuine emotional spasm in the initial confrontation and then engage a completely different operating mode within 48 hours when the legal reality sets in. It doesn't mean the emotion wasn't real. It means the self-preservation instinct is also real. What does Forsyth's involvement change? It means the process will be adversarial rather than cooperative, which, given the financial documentation we have, is not a problem for us. It simply means more time and more process." A brief pause. "There's something else. Forsyth's office sent a preliminary letter this morning alongside the standard acknowledgement of our filing. They're disputing the characterization of Carter Meridian as a marital asset diversion." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. "On what grounds?" "They're framing Carter Meridian as a legitimate business entity with legitimate operations separate from marital finances and suggesting that any flows between it and personal accounts represent standard business cash management rather than fraud. Sandra's tone remained even. It's a predictable argument. It's also one that Paul's documentation addresses directly. But it tells us Daniel has given Forsyth enough information to attempt this framing, which means he's not going to concede the financial narrative without a fight. Good, Emily said. Sandra paused. Good? I've been married to a man who managed narratives for 11 years, Emily said. I would rather fight on documented ground than negotiate on his terms. Let him argue. The paper trail doesn't argue back. Sandra made the sound that Emily had come to recognize as her version of approval. I'll send you Forsyth's preliminary letter by end of day. Read it and call me tomorrow morning. Emily hung up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the letter still sitting on the table. Daniel's copy, she should forward it to his hotel. She picked it up and felt the weight of it, this ordinary envelope that contained the formal beginning of the end of an 11-year marriage. And she felt what she had been carefully monitoring herself to feel appropriately, and not excessively. A deep structural sadness that was real and that she was not going to pretend wasn't there. Then she put the envelope in a larger envelope with Daniel's hotel address written on it and left it by the front door for the afternoon mail pickup. She had work to do. The work in the 2 weeks that followed was not the kind that looked dramatic from the outside. It was paperwork and phone calls and meetings in Sandra's office, and a conference call with Paul that lasted hours, and covered the amended financial summary he had produced after Diane Hayes provided him, through her own attorney, with the document she had found on Robert's computer. The amended summary was significant. The secondary routing layer Robert had helped Daniel construct added an estimated $68,000 to the figure already documented. This took the confirmed total to approximately $288,000 over the 6-year period. Paul also identified 3 specific client invoices where Carter Meridian had been listed as a subcontractor for services that, on examination, corresponded to no deliverable in the firm's project records. These 3 invoices were the piece that shifted the nature of what Emily was involved in. Marcus Chen, the corporate litigation attorney Sandra had referred her to, made this shift explicit in a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the Friday dinner. Mrs. Carter, Marcus, based on the documentation now available, we have grounds to argue that the invoicing structure constitutes wire fraud as a matter of federal law. I want to be clear about what that means practically, Emily said. It means that this is no longer only a civil matter between you and your husband. The firm has been contacted. They are conducting their own internal review. Depending on what that review reveals, they may refer the matter to federal investigators independently of any action you choose to take. He paused. You are not required to take any criminal action. Your divorce proceedings and financial recovery can proceed entirely on the civil track. But I want you to understand that the information you've provided may set other processes in motion, regardless of your personal choices. Emily sat with this for a moment. She had not walked into this intending to put Daniel in criminal jeopardy. She had walked into it intending to recover what was hers and to end a marriage that had been built on deception. Those were the goals she had carried from Chicago to Columbus, and through 3 weeks of methodical preparation, and through the Friday dinner, and through 2 weeks of attorneys and documentation. But she had also told Sandra at the very beginning that she wanted the full truth visible. She had said, I want everything he hid from me to be on the table. She had said that knowing, on some level, that the truth she was asking for was large. I understand, she told Marcus. I'm not going to obstruct a process that the firm initiates independently. That's not my responsibility to manage. That's the right answer, Marcus said. And for what it's worth, Mrs. Carter, in my experience, people who build structures like this one are rarely doing it in one relationship only. The patterns tend to be comprehensive. She thought about that after she hung up. The patterns tend to be comprehensive. She thought about what that meant for Olivia Bennett. She had not thought about Olivia as much as she might have expected to. In the early days, in the hotel room in Chicago and the flight home, and the 2 weeks of controlled calm, Olivia had existed in her mind primarily as a structural element of what Daniel had built, not a person Emily had a relationship with, not a rival, not even really an object of anger, but a component of the architecture that Emily was dismantling. But now, sitting in her kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon with Marcus Chen's words in the air around her, Emily thought about Olivia in a different way. She thought about what Olivia believed she had. Olivia Bennett had spent 7 years building a life with a man she knew was married. She had participated in the financial structure. She had helped conceal the relationship through the contractor arrangement with Carter Meridian. She had made choices, calculated and sustained choices, about what she wanted and how to get it. But she had also built those choices on Daniel's version of Emily. On the version of Emily that Daniel had presented to her, presumably which was the version Daniel found most useful, the wife who didn't notice, the woman who was present but not really seen, the placeholder. To use the word he had thrown at her in the airport confrontation Emily had opened this story with, the word that had landed like a fist, because it was the word Daniel believed and had perhaps shared with someone who had listened to it and believed it alongside him. Olivia thought Emily was a placeholder. She was about to find out what a placeholder could do when she finally understood her own value. Emily did not call Olivia. She had no intention of calling Olivia. But she thought about her with a kind of distant, structural empathy that surprised her, the recognition that another woman had been given a version of events designed to make her complicit, and that the disillusionment coming for Olivia, when the full picture emerged, was going to be its own particular devastation. That was not Emily's responsibility to manage either. 3 weeks after the Friday dinner, Sandra called with an update that changed the pace of everything. Forsyth's office has requested a settlement conference, Sandra said. They want to meet informally before we proceed to formal discovery. Emily was in her car in the parking lot of the grocery store, where she had driven specifically to take this call away from the house. Why? Because the firm completed its preliminary internal review this week, Sandra said, and they've referred the matter to outside counsel, which means Daniel's professional situation has become significantly more urgent than his personal one. A pause. Forsyth is smart enough to know that a prolonged adversarial divorce proceeding, running parallel to a professional misconduct investigation and a potential criminal referral, is not a good situation for his client. He wants to resolve the civil divorce on terms that allow Daniel to focus his resources on the professional matter. Emily processed this. He wants to settle. He wants to discuss settlement. Yes, on what terms? That's what the conference is for. We don't know yet. Sandra paused. Emily, I want to give you my honest assessment. Please, if we go to full discovery, the process takes 12 to 18 months and exposes everything comprehensively. Daniel's professional situation becomes more severe. The financial recovery is likely higher, but the timeline is longer and the cost is higher. A brief If we settle, we can potentially recover a comparable amount in a significantly shorter time, with less exposure on your part as well. You would not be required to testify in formal proceedings. The documentation does the work. What does my part have to do with it? Emily said. I haven't done anything wrong. No, Sandra agreed. But formal proceedings have a quality that settlement does not. They are public, they generate records. Your marriage, your private life, and some of the more painful specifics of what you've described to me become part of a discoverable record. A pause. I'm not suggesting you should settle to avoid that. I'm giving you the full picture. Emily looked through the windshield at the parking lot, at ordinary people doing ordinary things with their ordinary Saturday mornings. When is the conference? She said. They've proposed next Thursday. I'll be there, Emily said. But Sandra, I want something in the settlement terms that Forsyth should understand is non-negotiable. Tell me. Full written acknowledgement of the Carter Meridian transactions as marital asset diversions. Not a general settlement figure with mutual releases. A specific, documented acknowledgement that those funds were marital assets that were fraudulently diverted. She paused. I'm not doing this for the money alone. I'm doing it for the record. I want there to be a record that says what he did. Even if it's only in the settlement agreement. Even if no one outside this process ever reads it. Sandra was quiet for 2 seconds. I can argue for that, she said. Forsyth will push back. Let him push. The settlement conference was held on Thursday morning in a conference room at Sandra's firm. Emily arrived with Sandra and Paul Nguyen, whose presence as the forensic accountant who had built the financial documentation was partly practical and partly strategic, a quiet signal to Forsyth's team that the numbers were not going to be a productive area for dispute. She had not expected Daniel to be there. She had expected attorneys. She had expected the managed distance of legal representation standing between them. Instead, when she walked into the conference room, Daniel was already seated across the table with Forsyth beside him, and they made eye contact before Emily had fully processed that he was there. He looked different, not physically different in any dramatic way. But the specific quality of his appearance had shifted, the careful grooming slightly less precise than usual. The managed confidence of his posture present but operating at reduced capacity, the way a very controlled person looked when they were controlling something, more than they normally had to. He looked like a man under pressure that he had no apparatus left to conceal. He looked, Emily thought, something like his actual age. Forsyth opened the conference with the professional affability of a man who had done this many times and had no investment in the emotions of anyone in the room. He was efficient and precise and not unkind. And he laid out the framework of what his client was prepared to offer with directness of someone who was the other side, had strong cards and wasn't here to pretend otherwise. The opening offer was not adequate. Emily knew it before Sandra finished listening to it. She watched Sandra's face do nothing in particular and knew that nothing in particular was the professional signal for insufficient. The Carter Meridian transaction, Sandra said when Forsyth finished. My client's position is that the full amount, inclusive of the amended figure reflecting the secondary routing layer your client used in partnership with Robert Hayes, constitutes marital assets fraudulently diverted. We're not here to negotiate that characterization. Forsyth looked at his notes. He looked at Daniel briefly. He looked back at Sandra. My client acknowledges that Carter Meridian funds were used for personal purposes that were not disclosed to Mrs. Carter, Forsyth said carefully. That's not what we asked for, Sandra said. What my client is prepared to mark. Sandra used Forsyth's first name with the ease of two people who had been across from each other many times. My client has been very clear about one term that is not open for negotiation. She wants a specific, documented acknowledgement in the settlement agreement that the Carter Meridian transactions constitute fraudulent diversion of marital assets. Not acknowledgement of personal use, not general settlement language. Specific characterization. Forsyth looked at Daniel again. This time Emily watched Daniel's face. He was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, the same gesture he had used at the dining room table the night she confronted him, and she understood that this was what Daniel Carter looked like when he had run out of room to manage a situation. I need 5 minutes with my client, Forsyth said. Sandra nodded. Emily and Sandra and Paul moved to the small anteroom adjacent to the conference room and stood in the quiet. Paul poured water from the carafe on the side table. Sandra reviewed something on her tablet. Emily stood and did not fidget and looked at the wall. He's going to take it, Sandra said, not looking up from the tablet. The language, Emily said, yes. The number, the characterization, the acknowledgement. He's going, are you confident? Sandra looked up. Because the firm's outside counsel is in the building this morning. I saw the name on the visitor log when we came in. She looked at Emily directly. They're not here for this conference. They're here for a separate meeting. But the fact that they're here today, on the same morning as this conference, tells me that Daniel's professional situation has escalated in the past 72 hours, and that Forsyth knows his client needs this divorce resolved so he can put all his resources toward the other matter. Emily absorbed this. Something happened this week, Emily said. Something happened this week, Sandra confirmed. I don't know exactly what, but yes. They went back into the conference room 8 minutes later. Forsyth was composed. Daniel did not look up immediately. My client accepts the characterization language, Forsyth said. In exchange, we'd like to discuss the total recovery figure. What followed was 2 hours of negotiation that Emily sat through with her hands in her lap and her breathing even, and her eyes moving between the documents and Sandra's face, reading Sandra the way she had learned over the past 6 weeks to read her attorney by the pace of her speech, the angle of her attention, the slight variations in how she held her pen when she was satisfied versus when she was working through something. Sandra was working through something for 45 minutes, and then she was satisfied. The final figure was not $288,000. It was higher. It included the full Carter Meridian amount, the value of the Glenwood Park property as a marital asset that had been fraudulently acquired with marital funds, and a structure for the division of remaining marital assets that accounted for Emily's 11 years of contributed labor, household management, and career sacrifice. The total recovery, structured over 2 years with specific payment guarantees and asset liens, was significant enough that Paul, when the number was written down, permitted himself a small nod that at Emily understood meant they had done better than expected. But the number, as significant as it was not the moment that stayed with Emily. The moment came at the end of the conference, when the formal discussion was concluded, and Forsyth was gathering some materials. Paul and Fowler was the term sheet with Sandra, and Daniel across the table finally looked up. He looked at Emily directly, the way he had not quite done since she had walked into the room. She looked back at him. He opened his mouth, and she thought he was going to say something. Some version of what he had said Friday night. The apology that she had told him wasn't sufficient yet, or some attempt at a final word that the presence of attorneys would make awkward and incomplete. Instead, he closed his mouth. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he looked away. She understood watching him look away, something she hadn't fully understood before. She had expected that seeing him, really seeing him, in the specific unmanaged way that this conference had made unavoidable, would feel like something acute. Grief or rage or the gutting loneliness of realizing what was gone. Instead, she felt something quieter and more final. She felt the specific sensation of a chapter ending. Not a dramatic ending, not the ending of a movie or a story, but the ordinary, irrevocable ending that real endings had, the moment when a thing is simply done, when the weight you've been carrying finds its resting place, and you realize that putting it down doesn't feel like loss so much as it feels like the beginning of being able to stand up straight. She picked up her bag. She thanked Paul. She said she would call Sandra that afternoon. And she walked out of the conference room and down the hallway and through the lobby of Sandra's firm and out into the October air. October, the same month that had defined 7 years of her marriage's hidden architecture. The same month Daniel had packed his suitcase and kissed her goodbye and driven to the airport. The same month she had stood at the kitchen window and watched him go and tucked her instincts back into the drawer and told herself she was simply being paranoid. She stood on the sidewalk outside Sandra's building and let October move around her. The cool air and the smell of the season and the ordinary sounds of the city, and she breathed. Her phone rang. It was Michael. "How did it go?" he said. "We have a settlement," she said, a beat of silence. "Then tell me," she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was rare for Michael, and when she finished he was quiet-sight for 4 full seconds. "The characterization language," he said. She got it in. His voice was rougher than usual. I know," she said, because the language was the thing. The number was substantial and the asset division was fair, and the recovery represented something real and meaningful and hard-won. But the language, the specific document, legally binding acknowledgement that what Daniel had done constituted fraudulent diversion, that it was named for what it was in a document that would exist permanently, that was the piece Emily had refused to negotiate. She had wanted a record. She had it. "What do you need?" Michael said. She thought about the question. She thought about what Cora had brought over. Good coffee and no advice. She thought about what Carol had said when Emily had finally called her with the full story. "You have always been the strongest person in this family, and I have always pretended not to know it because I thought it would make you lonely. And I was wrong about that." She thought about what Sandra had told her about the women who did well. "I need lunch," Emily said, "something with too much cheese. Somewhere that's not related to any of this." Michael laughed. "A real one, I know a place," he said. "I'll drive." She stood on the sidewalk and waited for her brother and felt the October sun on her face and thought about the chrysanthemums in the window box at home. The ones she had planted for herself, the ones that had been blooming for 3 weeks without requiring anything from her except that she had put them somewhere they could grow. She thought about the guest room where she had cried honestly and then slept and woken up to start the next day. She thought about the folder on the dining room table. She thought about the handwritten notes she had spent 7 Octobers tucking into Daniel Carter's front pocket, and about the fact that he had read everyone, and about the fact that she did not regret writing them. She had written them because she had meant them. The love she had put into those notes had been real, and she had given it freely, and it had not been wasted simply because its recipient had not honored it. It had been hers, the love had been hers, and the care had been hers, and the steadiness had been hers, and none of it had been diminished by what Daniel chose to do with it. She understood that now in a way she hadn't quite managed to understand before today. The settlement conference had done something unexpected. It had closed the last door she had been leaving open. Not because of the number, not because of the language, but because she had sat across from Daniel Carter and watched him finally run out of room to be anyone other than who he was, and she had felt nothing she couldn't manage, and she had stood up and walked out, and the sky outside was the same October sky it had always been. Michael's car pulled up. She got in. "You okay?" he said. She put on her seatbelt. "I think," she said, with the careful honesty of someone testing a word before she committed to it, "I think I might actually be." He pulled into traffic. She looked out the window at the city moving past and thought about what Sandra had said, "The getting better is something you are already doing." She was. She had been doing it since Chicago, since the airport, since the moment she stepped out from behind the pillar and watched the door of her recognizable life close and made the decision not to pretend it was still open. The road ahead was not simple. There were payment structures to monitor and legal processes still in motion and a professional misconduct investigation that would unfold on its own timeline. There were the ordinary, grinding to cause it rebuilding a life that had been organized around another person's press and services. There were the days that would be harder than today, when the clarity would thin and the loneliness would be louder, and the work of being okay would require more effort than it was requiring right now. She knew that. She was not expecting easy. She was expecting her own life, with all its difficulty and all its possibility, completely and finally and irrevocably hers. That was enough. That was more than enough. Michael parked in front of a restaurant she didn't recognize. He got out and she got out and they walked inside together, and someone showed them to a table. And Emily Carter sat down and picked up the menu and decided to order the thing that looked best to her without considering whether Daniel would have liked it too. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after Emily Carter had sat at the kitchen table and opened a folder that changed everything. Sandra called her at 9:47 in the morning with the news, and her voice had its usual precision but also something warmer underneath it, the tone of a woman who had worked hard on something and was allowing herself one moment of quiet satisfaction for moving on to the next case. "It's done," Sandra said. "The court has entered the final decree. The settlement terms are binding and enforceable. The first payment structure activates within 30 days. Emily was standing in the kitchen when the call came. She was holding a mug of coffee with both hands, the way she always did in the morning, and she looked at the window box and the chrysanthemums that had survived the winter better than anyone had expected them to. And she said, "Thank you, Sandra, for all of it." "You did the work," Sandra said. "I provided the architecture. You provided a great deal more than that." A brief pause. "Take care of yourself, Emily. Call me if you need anything." And I mean that not just professionally. Emily set the phone on the counter and stood in the kitchen, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning in February, and let the finality of it land. Not with drama. Not with the kind of release she had seen in movies, where a person opened a window and breathed deeply and the music told you how to feel. Just the ordinary, complete settling of something that had been in motion for a long time coming to rest. It was done. She finished her coffee. She made a grocery list. She called Cora. Sandra called, she said when Cora picked up. Cora was quiet for exactly 1 second, and then made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a shout, the kind of sound that was uniquely Cora's and that Emily had known since college, and that she had needed more times than she could count over the past 4 months. "It's final," Cora said, "as of this morning. Emily Walsh." Cora used her maiden name the way she had started doing 2 months ago, naturally without comment, simply shifting to match the name Emily had legally restored. "We are going out to dinner tonight, not discussion. Not a question tonight." "Tonight," she agreed. She did not spend the day celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate in the conventional sense. The finalization of a divorce was not a triumph. It was a completion, and completion was its own different thing. Instead, she spent the morning doing the things she had been doing for the past 4 months, managing the practical reconstruction of a life that had been organized around a person who was no longer in it. She had listed the Columbus house in December, 2 months after Daniel left. It had sold faster than the realtor expected, which the realtor attributed to the market, and which Emily privately attributed to the fact that she had spent 8 years keeping it in excellent condition. She had used the equity, combined with the first payment from the settlement structure, to purchase a smaller house on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood she had always liked but had never lived in because Daniel had preferred the western suburbs. The new house had large windows, a backyard with a mature oak tree, a kitchen that got morning light from the east, and window boxes on every south-facing window, which Emily had specified in the purchase requirements with a directness that had made her realtor pause and then nod. She had moved in 6 weeks ago. She had spent those 6 weeks doing things on her own timeline, at her own pace, without consulting anyone about whether the choices were right. She painted the living room a color that was too bold for Daniel's taste. She bought a reading chair that was slightly too large for the room and positioned it exactly where the light hit in the late afternoon. She cooked the things she wanted to eat for dinner without factoring in anyone else's preferences, and she left dishes in the sink overnight sometimes when she was tired, and she played music in the morning that Daniel had described as too melancholy. She was not particularly melancholy. The music was just good. 3 weeks after the move, Michael had come over to help her set up bookshelves, and they had spent a Saturday afternoon doing it with the efficiency of two people who had known each other their whole lives and had been through something significant together. When the shelves were up, Michael had stood back and looked at the room and said, with the quiet directness that was his most characteristic quality, "You look different." "Different how?" Emily had said. He had thought about it for a moment. "Like yourselves," he said. She had not known what to say to that. So she had made them both coffee, and they had sat in the new kitchen and talked about other things. And the comment had stayed with her the way true things did, not sharp but settled. She looked like herself. She was working on that, actively and consciously, for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate. She had gone back to work in January, taking a contract position with a hospital network, doing administrative consulting she had left 11 years ago, which turned out to be a field that still wanted her. Her supervisor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Yu, had interviewed her with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no time for excess, and had hired her on the same day with the comment, "You are significantly overqualified for this, and I suspect you know it. Which means you chose it deliberately. That's the kind of judgment I want on my team." Emily had started on a Monday and by Wednesday had been given a project that required the exact combination of analytical precision and emotional intelligence. She had spent 11 years developing it inside. She would now be leaving. She found to her own slight surprise that the work felt good. Not as an escape from her life, but as a return to a part of herself she had set aside without examining why. She was examining why now, with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Brennan, who had an office on the north side and a manner that was warm without being soft, and who had said to Emily in their third session, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer without filtering it first." Emily had agreed. "What did you want?" Dr. Brennan had said, "before you became the person who managed Daniel's life? What did you want for yourself?" Emily had opened her mouth and found, to her considerable discomfort, that the answer did not come immediately. She had to reach for it. She had to go back further than she expected, past the marriage, past the years of careful accommodation and strategic self-silencing, back to the person she had been before she became the person who had learned to read Daniel's moods and adjust accordingly. She had wanted to travel, not with a partner, not on a schedule organized around someone else's availability, but the way she had done once in her mid-20s, alone with a bag and a plan loose enough to change, and 3 weeks in which every decision was hers. She had wanted to finish her master's degree. She had started it before meeting Daniel and had stopped, not because he asked her to, not explicitly, but because his needs and his career and the choreography of their shared life had made the time feel unavailable, and she had learned not to ask for time that felt unavailable. She had wanted to live in a house with large windows and morning light from the east. She had 3 of those things now, and she was working on a plan for the first 2. The morning the divorce was finalized, after the call from Sandra and the call from Cora and the grocery list, Emily sat down at her kitchen table with the laptop she used for everything and opened a tab she had been opening with increasing frequency over the past 6 weeks. She looked at flight prices to Portugal. She had never been to Portugal. She had wanted to go for years, had mentioned it once to Daniel on the occasion of a travel magazine left open on the coffee table, and he had said something vague about maybe next year, and the conversation had ended the way conversations with Daniel often ended, with a diffusion that felt like deferral but was actually a quiet, consistent refusal to engage with anything that was primarily hers. Next year had not come. She looked at flights for October. October, which had meant something specific and painful for 7 years, was now available to mean something else. She had been thinking about this deliberately, not in a therapeutic sense, but in a practical one, the way you thought about reclaiming a word that had been used against you, returning it to its original condition through use. She found a flight, round trip, Columbus to Lisbon, with a connection in Newark. October 8th, the anniversary of the day she had followed Daniel to Chicago, which she chose not for symbolism, but because the price was right on that date, and because she had enough of her own story, now that the date's previous associations no longer owned it. She looked at the price for a long time. Then she entered her credit card information and booked it. It was that simple. One decision made entirely for herself, on a February Tuesday morning in a house with large windows and east-facing light, and nothing about it required anyone else's approval or accommodation. She sat back in her chair and looked at the confirmation email that arrived in her inbox. Emily Walsh, Columbus to Lisbon, October 8. She closed the laptop and finished her coffee and did not overthink it. What she did not yet know, sitting in her kitchen on that February Tuesday, was that the next 8 months were going to require a resilience she had already built but had not yet fully tested. Because the settlement agreement's binding and enforceable language, which Sandra had constructed with such precision, was about to meet the specific reality of what happened when a man, under simultaneous pressure from a divorce settlement, a professional misconduct investigation, and what had by late January become a formal federal inquiry, decided that compliance was slower than his attorneys were advising him to make it. The first payment under the settlement structure was due within 30 days of the finalization date. It did not arrive. Sandra called Emily day 32 with the tone of a woman who was not surprised by this but was moving immediately. Forsyth's office is claiming a temporary cash flow issue related to the professional matter, Sandra said. They're requesting a 60-day extension. The agreement doesn't provide for a 60-day extension, Emily said. No, Sandra said, it does not. What are our options? We move to enforce. We file a motion citing breach of settlement terms and we ask the court to impose the lien we built into the agreement for exactly this scenario. A brief pause. Emily, we anticipated this. The asset lien, it is documented. His ability to delay is limited. How limited? His primary financial assets, the investment accounts, the remaining equity in the business are subject to the lien. He cannot liquidate or transfer them without triggering immediate court intervention. Sandra's voice was precise. He is not in a position to run. He is in a position of someone who is delaying because delay is the only move available, and his attorneys are letting him make it because attorneys bill hourly. Emily absorbed this. She had expected the process to be difficult. She had been told by Sandra and Paul and Marcus that the periodicity settlement was often where the real endurance was required, when the initial momentum of confrontation gave way to the grinding, unglamorous work of enforcement. File the motion, Emily said. Already drafted, Sandra said. I just needed your authorization. You have it. She hung up the phone and went to work. She did not spend the next 6 weeks consumed by the enforcement proceeding. That was the thing she had discovered about herself in the months since October. She was capable, when she chose to be, of holding a difficult process in one hand and living her life in the other without letting the difficult process colonize everything. She had learned this. She thought, from the 3 weeks of careful preparation before the Friday dinner, when she had managed the full weight of what she was doing, while making coffee and having conversations and planting chrysanthemums. She had learned that she could carry hard things without becoming them. She went to work. She worked on the hospital network project and took on a second contract in March that Dr. Ewan recommended her for, with the specific words, she's the best analytical mind I've worked with in a decade and she's only going to be available for the short term, so take her now. She ran 3 mornings a week, which she had not done in years, and which turned out to be the thing her body had been quietly asking for. Through years of tension, it had expressed as shoulder pain and tight sleep. She had dinner with Cora every Thursday. She called Carol every Sunday. She went to Dr. Brennan every Tuesday and worked through the things that still needed working through, which were real and not few, because rebuilding a self that had been organized around someone else's needs for 11 years was not something that happened in 4 months or 8 months, or probably even in a defined period that could be neatly closed. It was ongoing work, the kind that got easier and more interesting the further into it you went. She thought about Daniel less and less, and when she did think about him, it was with a clarity rather than a charge. The way you thought about a chapter you had read fully and set down, you understood it completely, but you weren't living inside it anymore. The lien was enforced in April. The court ordered liquidation of 2 of Daniel's investment accounts to Sarah's first payment obligation and a portion of the second. Forsyth's objections were overruled. Sandra sent Emily the confirmation with a 2-sentence note. First payment satisfied in full, second payment schedule reinstated with court oversight. Emily read the note twice and saved it in the folder she had created on her laptop labeled, "Simply done." What came next was not something Emily had prepared for. In May, Marcus Chen called her. He called on a Thursday afternoon when she was between meetings at work, and she stepped into the hallway to take it and recognized from the specific texture of his usual calm that something had shifted. "The federal inquiry has reached a resolution," Marcus said. Emily pressed her back against the hallway wall. "Tell me, Daniel and Robert Hayes have both entered into plea agreements. Daniel's agreement includes a fine, a period of supervised release, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of a public company, and restitution to the firm's clients for the fraudulently invoiced amounts." Marcus paused. Robert's agreement is somewhat more severe given that he facilitated the structure with direct knowledge of the fraudulent intent. Emily was quiet for a moment. She had known this was coming. Marcus had been updating her on the investigation's progress for months, and the trajectory had been clear since the firm's outside counsel became involved. But knowing something was coming and, it confirmed, were different experiences. "How much restitution?" she said, to the firm's clients. "Approximately $90,000 across the 3 fraudulent invoices. This is separate from and does not reduce what is owed to you under the settlement." And Daniel's position at the firm? He resigned in January. That was a condition of the firm's cooperation with the federal inquiry. Marcus paused. He will not be returning to the consulting industry in a meaningful capacity. The bar from public company positions is a significant professional limitation. She pressed the phone to her ear and thought about Dad Daniel at the conference table in Sandra's firm, his hands flat on the surface, the look of a man who had run out of room. She had seen it coming then. She had known, in the precise way of someone who had finally allowed herself to trust her own instincts, that this was the shape of what was ahead for him. She did not feel satisfaction. She had expected to, and the absence of it was itself informative. It told her that she had not, at any point in this process, actually wanted Daniel destroyed. She had wanted the truth and the recovery of what was hers, and the record that said what he did, and she had all of those things now. What he did with the remainder of his life was his own business. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, "for everything. You were an excellent client." "Emily," he said, clear-headed and patient. "Not everyone is." She went back into her meeting. She did not tell anyone at work about the call. She kept it in the same quiet interior space where she had kept many things over the past 8 months. The space that had once been a drawer full of accumulated evidence, and was now simply the part of her that had learned to carry weight without making it everyone else's burden to witness. That evening she called Michael. He answered with his usual economy. "Yeah, Marcus called," she said. "Plea agreements." A long pause. "Robert too," she said. "Good," Michael said. One word delivered with the quiet completeness of a man who had spent 8 months doing significant work on his sister's behalf and was allowing himself one moment of unambiguous resolution. "I want to buy you dinner," Emily said. "Somewhere good. Not the place with too much cheese. Somewhere actually good." "Saturday," Michael said. "Saturday," she agreed. She put the phone down and looked at the calendar on her kitchen wall, a real paper calendar, something she had started keeping in the new house because she liked the physical act of marking time, of writing things down with a pen and seeing the month laid out in front of her with her own handwriting on it. October was circled. The 8th, a small drawing of a plane beside the date, which she had put there the morning she booked the flight, and which had become, over the months since, a kind of daily reminder that she had something ahead that was entirely and exclusively hers. 4 months away, she was ready. The summer passed with the particular quality of a summer in which a person is rebuilding, not dramatic, not marked by obvious milestones, but full of a quiet accumulation of small choices that added up to something. She finished the hospital network contract and turned down a subsequent offer that would have been larger, but would also have been consuming, and she turned it down without second-guessing herself, which was new. She accepted instead a part-time research role at a university medical center that interested her and that left her with time, real-time time she could use. She enrolled in the master's program in late June. Health Administration, the degree she had left unfinished 11 years ago when her life had reorganized itself around a man's career. The enrollment process involved submitting old transcripts, writing a personal statement, and meeting with an advisor named Professor Gerald Oakake, who reviewed her file with evident interest and said, "You are returning to complete a degree you left in 2014. Tell me why you left and why you're coming back." She had told him. Not everything, but enough that she had made choices as she would make differently now, and that the returning was not about regret but about finishing what she had started, and finding out who she was when she was operating from her own center rather than someone else's. Professor Oakake had looked at her over the edge of his reading glasses. "Those tend to be the best students," he said, "the ones who come back knowing why." She started classes in September. 2 courses, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, which fit around her part-time research role and around her mornings, which she had come to guard with a quiet ferocity, as the time when she ran and thought and planned and simply existed without agenda. The program was harder than she had expected and more interesting than she had hoped. And both of those things were exactly right. On the 1st of October, Cora came over for dinner and they sat at the kitchen table, and Cora looked at the circled date on the calendar and said, 7 days, Emily said.
You've packed? I've started.
Cora looked at her with the expression she had been wearing more frequently in recent months, something that was not quite pride. Because Cora was too honest for uncomplicated pride, but something adjacent to it. Something that contained relief and admiration and the specific warmth of a friendship that had survived a complicated year. I need to say something, Cora said. Emily poured more wine. Say it. I should have told you. 2 years ago, at the airport, Cora wrapped both hands around her glass. I have thought about it almost every day since that night in October when you called me from Chicago. If I had said something, you would have had 2 more years. To Cora, Emily set the bottle down. I know you've been carrying that. I should have, maybe, Emily said. But here's what I also know. If you had told me 2 years ago, I don't know that I would have believed it the way I needed to. I don't know that I was ready to look at what was actually there. She paused. I went to Chicago when I was ready. I built the documentation when I was ready. I sat across the table from him when I was ready. The truth arrived when I had become the person who could actually use it. She looked at Cora directly. You didn't take anything from me. You don't get to carry that. Cora was quiet for a long moment. How are you so okay? She said finally, not with resentment. With genuine wonder. Emily thought about the question honestly. I'm not always, she said. There are mornings when I wake up and the first thing I feel is the specific loneliness of having built 11 years with someone and having to start over. There are evenings when the house is very quiet and I miss having a person there, not Daniel specifically, but the idea of a person, the warmth of being chosen. She paused, and then I remember what being chosen by the wrong person actually felt like, and the quiet stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like mine. Cora reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, not saying anything, in the way of 2 women who had known each other long enough that silence was its own form of conversation. On October 7th, the night before her flight, Emily stood in her bedroom and looked at the open suitcase on the bed. Her own suitcase, not the navy one she had packed for Daniel every year, folded and organized to his specifications, tucked with a handwritten note he would read and discard. Her own bag, smaller, packed with exactly what she wanted, nothing she didn't. She had spent the evening going through the final checklist: passport, travel insurance, the list of restaurants Michael had compiled for her, because Michael was thorough about everything, the small notebook she had bought, specifically for this trip, in which she intended to write whatever she felt like writing without it being useful or organized. She zipped the suitcase, she stood and looked at it, and she felt, rising up through her with the quietness of something that had been building for a long time, a feeling she recognized but had not felt with this specific quality in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly happiness was too simple a word for something this structural. More like the feeling of being entirely and accurately located, of knowing exactly where you were and ignored to be there. She picked up her phone. She had one more call to make. She called her sister Carol, who answered on the second ring with the immediate warmth of a woman who had been waiting to be needed and was glad to be called. I leave tomorrow morning, Emily said. I know, Carol said. I've had it on my calendar since February. Emily laughed. Of course you have. Are you excited? She sat on the edge of the bed next to the packed suitcase and thought about the question. Yes, she said, and something more than excited. I don't have the right word for it. Ready, Carol said immediately. Emily was quiet for a moment. Ready, she said. That's exactly it. They talked for 20 minutes about the trip, about the master's program, about Carol's kids and her husband, and the ordinary ongoing texture of a life being lived. And when they hung up, Emily sat in the quiet of her bedroom in the house she had chosen, with the suitcase she had packed for herself, and let the October night settle around her. She thought about 7 Octobers of Navy suitcases and handwritten notes and kitchen windows and silence. She thought about an airport in Chicago and a white SUV and a smile that had stopped being directed at her a long time before she saw it directed at someone else. She thought about a folder on a dining room table and a man whose hands went flat on the surface when he ran out of room and just the situation. She thought about Sandra's voice, precise and certain, about Paul's quiet nod, about Michael handing her a coffee without being asked, about Cora's sound that was somewhere between a sob and a shout. She thought about Dr. Brennan's question, what did you want? She thought about Portugal. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning. She turned off the light, and Emily Walsh, who had spent 11 years being the woman who stayed home while her husband went on his annual trip, closed her eyes and slept deeply and well in the knowledge that in the morning she was going somewhere she had chosen herself, for reasons that were entirely her own, carrying nothing that wasn't hers. The woman who had once watched from a kitchen window was gone. The woman getting on that plane tomorrow had looked and found the truth and built something real from the wreckage of a lie, and she was never, not for a single day of the life ahead of her, going to stop choosing herself again.